Let's join the conversation. Lowry Yankwich. Welcome. Before we dive in, a quick shout out that this podcast is made possible by a classical music education platform. All of the interviews included in this episode come directly from Tone-Based Lessons. Check them out at tonebase.co. Okay, let's dive in. Musicians have a complicated relationship with time. We worry endlessly about keeping it. We hope through an enchanting performance to stop it. But every so often, at the right moment and with the right piece, we do something different. We steal it. Today, we're going to be talking about tempo rubato, which is Italian for stolen time. At its most basic, rubato is when a musician temporarily departs from the pulse of the music. It can be for just a second or even a millisecond. Sometimes it's hardly noticeable at all. But musicians focus an enormous amount of attention and intention toward getting rubato right. As we'll see, the right rubato is highly elusive and contested. This is the legendary 20th century pianist Alfred Cortot, playing from Chopin's A-flat Ballade. Cortot was known in particular for his abundant use of rubato. You can hear it throughout his playing, a sort of ebb and flow. Is there a logic to it? A replicable method to the moments when Cortot chooses not to? Or is it like the jazz pianist Ethan Iverson says, that, quote, a musician's eighth notes are between him and his God? If you want to make a musician's head hurt, ask them to explain their rubato. It's a bit like asking a comedian to explain a joke. When musicians do comment on matters of expressive timing, the claims are often contradictory. This is pianist Emanuel Ax, paraphrasing what Czerny, one of Beethoven's students, said about his teacher's approach to keeping time.
Beethoven invariably played his music in one tempo, without flexibility. Of course, unless called for. It tells you nothing, right. Yes, he played exactly in one tempo, except when he chose not to.
Create shape, form, which is not mechanical, clock-driven in time. Just don't drive.
That's pianist Leon Fleischer, advocating a kind of rubato that creates the space for shapes to appear in the music. But then Fleischer can also be found extolling the virtues of playing perfectly in time.
When something is really in time, it sets something inside of us resonating, vibrating to something that's absolutely in time, and it becomes irresistible.
Quotes like these can make it feel like talking rationally about rubato is a fool's errand. And yet, is there some understanding we can gain about rubato, even if we can't divine a rubato formula? I think the answer is yes, and in this episode, I'll try to prove it, with the help of an ensemble cast of great artists who've spent their lives refining their interpretive strategies. This is pianist Gwendolyn Mock, describing one piece in which rubato is totally appropriate, and another when it totally is not.
If you think about playing Clair de Lune, for example, which everybody plays, and you get to that section. There's so much forgiveness there in terms of rubato and expressivity, but you would never do that in Ravel. So even if you play something of equivalent texture, let's say in Undine, and you get to that melody, play it as you would play that section that I just played in Clair de Lune, with a lot of emotion, with a lot of, rubato, because it really destroys that feeling of pudeur, which means restrained. It means full of feeling, but not showing.
Here's a different example from pianist Sarah Davis Buchner, where she advocates for some bending of time, but not too much, in fitting with a particular style she associates with Mozart.
Secure knowledge of classical style, of Mozartian style, is really, really necessary to play this movement because, of course, if you overdo that and start to play in a very lavish romantic style, then it could come out. And I think anyone would agree this is not really what you want to produce.
As pianists, how do we make sense of this huge variety of possibilities when it comes to taking time within music? It's a question that's historical, personal, philosophical, and even biological.
A pulse is as important to music making as our heartbeat is to our being alive. And you have to, just like we do with our heartbeat, you have to breathe within pulse.
That's pianist Anne-Marie Mcdermott. The way she thinks about rubato, especially when playing Bach, is tied to the metaphor of breath. Music needs life, and life requires breath.
If you have the structure, the foundation of pulse, you have so many options of how within these big beats you can slightly alter pulse.
The idea is that there's a fundamental pulse to the music that needs to be preserved, but around which the musician can play. It's kind of like a fish swimming downstream, but occasionally jumping out of the water, momentarily gaining separation from the flow.
Let me try and give an example from the C minor Bach partita. All right, So very subtly, I'm stretching out the pulse between eighth notes once in a while. But in the bigger, longer line, I'm doing nothing to alter the pulse. I'm just letting it ebb and flow a little bit.
Pianist Simona Dinnerstein also thinks about timing in Bach in terms of breath.
The problem with Bach's music is that it can start to get into a groove and then everything gets kind of flattened in the music. It's almost like there's a click track going on all the time of these quarter notes. If you're having a click track, there's no way that you can have this kind of room for breathing.
This is Dinnerstein playing from Bach's D minor concerto.
It's not so far from feeling the beats, but sometimes a little bit on the front of the beat and sometimes a little bit on the back of the beat. And I'm thinking about getting away from the beats all the time.
Both Dinnerstein and Mcdermott are taking tiny amounts of time around still keeping the overall pulse. And there's an argument to be made that this actually enhances our perception of the beat in the music.
Ideally, what we have is an inevitability about the pulse. But that people aren't aware that the pulse is so strong. And that comes very much of having this baseline pulse that is unchangeable and within that variety.
One of the things I like to recall is that the columns of the Greek temples were admired for their evenness.
That's pianist and Juilliard professor Jerome Lowenthal.